Welcome in to Mississippi State Live on the Voice of College Football Network. I'm your host, Andrew Miller. Just me today here on the pod, and I just realized I had the pod playing in the background as well, which is why I was hearing an echo, which was very weird. That was not great to go with. But yeah, just me on the show today. Christian Ballard not going to be here. He'll be back next week on the pod. Next week it'll be August, which means it'll be game month. We'll have college football next week. We will have college football next month. I can't talk right now. And actually, right now, as we're recording, we are 1 month away from it being game week. We'll start talking about Mississippi State taking their trip down to Hattiesburg to open up the season against the Southern Miss Golden Eagles. And that's a game we're actually going to talk a little bit more about later in this episode, because kind of the main theme of this episode are what are the 5 most important games of the season for Mississippi State. And kind of burying the lead a little bit, I do think that season opener is one of them. We'll get into that in just a sec. Also, off of that list, there's one team where I think the season they had, one of those opponent states going to play, the season they had last year can kind of be a jumping off point for Mississippi State to look to as they try to orchestrate their own sort of turnaround. So that's going to be the main topic for today's show, but we want to start off because there is some recruiting news. The Mississippi State Bulldogs picked up a commitment over the weekend from offensive lineman Cameron Thompson, a 6'3", 300-pound interior prospect out of Havana, Florida, Gadsden County High School. 247 Sports rates him as an 86 overall 3-star, the number 99 interior O-line prospect, number 142 player within the state of Florida. 86 overall on the 247 composite as well. A kid that you look at the offer sheet and you see a couple programs really jump off. You see Auburn, you see Texas A&M, and it's like, okay, maybe the offers don't quite line up with the current projection. Now, I will say those are offers that did happen pretty early in the cycle, so there is some level of how much are those teams really pursuing. But even beyond those programs, you do have legitimately good power conference offers for this guy. Virginia Tech, NC State, Vanderbilt recently offered, Louisville offered last September. So you've got solid power conference programs that are offering Thompson. And look, this is another good pickup for Mississippi State. You're now up to 5 offensive linemen in the class for the season. And Sports Talk with Austin, what's up, guys? What's going on? I just checked comments for the first time. You've got 5 offensive linemen committed now in the class. And of those guys, all of them have other power conference offers. Obviously, Dalton Toothman sort of leads the way when you look at the teams that he had at the top of the list. Clemson going after him, Ole Miss, Auburn. Really good list of teams. And look, so far, Phil Lodeholt is doing a very good job with what he is doing on the recruiting trail in terms of building up this class. And obviously, you've had a couple decommitments. 2 of the higher-rated guys you had between Emmanuel Tucker and Jacoby Green, both decommitting, and now Tucker committed to LSU, Green's committed to Florida State, and actually you offered Thompson shortly after losing Green. So it was just sort of a 1-month turnaround between offering him and getting that commitment. But look, if you're going to have to lose a player and make up for him, bringing in a guy who does have other power conference offers and does have legitimate programs that are interested in him, and not just going after guys, as we've kind of seen on the defensive side of the ball, where the rest of the offer list doesn't really impress all that much. I think that's a good sign for the program. And look, you've got to build up the trenches more. That is a huge point of emphasis, I think, for Jeff Lebby and Phil Lodeholt for that matter, because of where State is at right now on the roster with an offensive line standpoint, having to be so transfer portal heavy. You've got to start loading up these guys in the high school ranks. And how many of these guys are really going to develop and be impact players? That's tough to say. O-line is one of those positions where it's tough to really project going forward who is going to really develop at the next level. Even the kids who have the big frames coming out of high school, not all of them get to college and end up being big-time players. It's really tough to see who's going to put on weight, who's going to keep their athleticism. Because of that, you just kind of have to stockpile solid players or good players if possible, and hope those guys turn into really good players for you down the line. So it's good to see what's happening with the O-line class. I like the work that Lodeholt has done. We've seen it on the transfer portal trail. Now we're seeing it in the high school ranks. And, getting into Mississippi State's offensive class as a whole, or really their class as a whole, ranked 44th nationally, 247. Now there's no getting around that is not good enough. That would be the worst the program has had in a very long time. The previous low, as far in recent history, was I think they were 41st in 2011, which that's one of those very interesting years where State's 41st in the rankings. It's on paper a terrible signing class for the program, and yet that's the class that produces guys like a Dak Prescott, a Josh Robinson, a Dylan Day. I think Bernard McKinney may or may not have been in that class. You had a lot of players who ended up being absolute superstars for Mississippi State that were not highly rated coming out of high school. But look, I'm the last person to try to argue that stars don't matter. They do. Recruiting rankings do matter. You can't just rely on the guys who end up being the diamonds in the rough. And I think it's getting harder and harder to find those types of guys. That being said, when it comes to the offensive class, State's done a pretty good job. You have a few guys that are highly ranked 3 stars, and frankly, guys who probably should be 4 stars. Dalton Toothman, as I mentioned earlier, right now is an 87 overall offensive tackle. With the offers that guys has, I would think that guy probably projects more as a 4-star. The one that no one can possibly understand, J.J. Hill from Tupelo. I don't know how anyone has watched that kid play and comes away with anything other than that he's a 4-star legitimate SEC player. And the offer sheet backs it up. He's got a lot of big-time programs after him. Those are guys you could see moved up. Zayion Cotton, kind of the wide receiver tight end hybrid guy out of Grenada. 89 overall. Right now, he's your highest rated commitment. That's a guy that could get bumped up. And I think rivals may have had him as a 4-star previously. Zion Crumpton at receiver is another one as an 88 overall. A speedy receiver, which, you want plenty of that in the Jeff Lebby offense. Brody McCorder at quarterback. Kind of a borderline 3-4-star type prospect. For me, I look at the offensive class, and I think you're in a pretty good place with the pieces that you've been able to bring in. At every single position, you've got guys with legitimate power conference offers. You've got guys with legitimate SEC offers stepping in. And that's sort of the big thing I'm going to look to there. With Lebby, I'm going to trust that they're going to get the offensive production. And I'm going to trust that they're going to be able to put those guys in positions to succeed. And I talked about this in the last show. It's probably a thing I'm going to say time and time again because I think it's a valid point to hit on when it comes to projecting recruiting rankings versus production on the field. You can take lesser offensive talent, and because of just the nature with offense in terms of using motions, using formations, option schemes, RPOs, just playing with spacing, playing with tempo, misdirection, all of those tools, you can take guys that maybe are not superstars, and as long as you have a couple guys who are pretty decent athletes, you can find ways to make offense productive. And if there's anyone that's going to be able to field a productive offense just off the pieces they have, Jeff Lebby is one of those guys, which is why I look at this class and I look at the receiving talent that they're bringing in. It's like, okay, yeah, those are guys State can absolutely work with. Those are guys State will fit well within this offense. You've got some speedsters. You got guys who are burners downfield. Cotton at tight end, a receiving threat, big body tight end. Lebby's made good use of those guys in the past. McWhorter, I know that's kind of how much is that guy really going to play for you, given what you're expecting at the future at quarterback? But you got to take a quarterback every single year in the class, and that's a guy who power conference programs want, other SEC programs we're interested in. And then J.J. Hill at running back is really good. O-line was kind of the one place where it was a little iffy, but as I mentioned, Dalton Toothman is a really good pickup for them. And with the other guys they have in that class, just getting big bodies in, guys who have reasonable athleticism, reasonable offers, you can work with that. So, I look at the offensive class. I think that side of the ball, they're in fine shape. Sports Talk, it's really hard to keep guys and bring guys in after the program has had a rough 2 years since Mike Leach passed away. It's been rough for Mississippi State playing in a rough SEC conference. You're not wrong. And it definitely, the program is very much in flux at this moment, and it's going to take some time working the transfer portal, which they've done, and to really solidify and create a basis and foundation to build off of. And then it has to come in with the high school ranks. I don't think you can rely on the portal long term. But again, I like what they're doing at the high school level when it comes to offensive recruiting. Defensive recruiting is another story. Defensive recruiting is frankly why this class is in the position that it is right now. It's just ranked 44th. You have a lot of guys where State is the only power conference offer. You have a lot of guys where you're competing against Sunbelt and MAC programs and FCS programs for commitments. We know that's not going to cut it. We also know at this point, it's kind of going to have to be a proof of concept thing. We talked about this a little bit on the last show. The only way you're really going to get guys interested in defense and coming and playing for this program is if you show it on the field that side of the ball has taken a step forward, or even if the defense struggles mightily again this year, are you strong enough offensively that it boosts you to a big season, at which case you win a few more games than maybe you're supposed to, you get some momentum, at which point a few defensive players say, you know what, I want to get on board with that. Maybe they're not a great defense, but that's a fun team I want to go play for. Offensive recruiting is going to be fine under Lebby. Even if the program struggles, Lebby has proof of concept as a play caller that you can come play for me and you're going to have a ton of production and I have a chance to develop you for the next level. So I'm not worried about the offensive recruiting. I think the offensive class to this point is in good shape. Defensive recruiting is where it's really going to have to take a step up. I'd imagine at this point, how many commitments does State have? They are at 26 commits to this point, and I know they're going to be in on more kids. You kind of have the bulk of the class made up. At this point, it's really a question of, do you get a few more guys at the defensive side of the ball? Do you process a few of the commitments that you have currently? Does any of that change? Will Lawrence coming in, biggest issue with recruiting I see is not even being able to get a visit from the higher ranked players in state. And then they got one total visit from the top 10. That is definitely a big problem. That is a huge problem right now, which it's a problem that weirdly is not exclusive to State. Now, the visit thing, Ole Miss is getting kids in on visits. State right now is not. But Ole Miss is also having a hard time keeping players in. Now, I'm not going to use that as an excuse. It's weird to me that Ole Miss is not making hay with a lot of these in-state recruits, especially with the talent there. I know there's always kind of a mentality of these guys just want to be able to go and get it. There's a lot of kids who grew up thinking, I got to get out of Mississippi. And because of that, you get some of these prospects, especially those who get the opportunity to go and play for a blue blood brand. As soon as they get that opportunity, they're gone. They're not going to stay home. That said, you would think with Ole Miss, with the way they've been playing in recent years, that they would be able to keep those guys in state a little bit more. And so it's an issue that goes beyond state. But to Will's point, yeah, not even being able to get them on campus is definitely an issue as well. Still, I think the offensive class I'm fine with. It is purely from what they're doing on the defensive side of the ball. That's where the recruiting class is really slipping. That's what's going to have to change to really turn things around. Again, for Sports Talk with Austin, Mississippi State does have a great history. Do you think these last couple of years have set them back and getting guys to come to Mississippi State? 100%. It is very much a case of what has transpired over these last few years, the program taking a downturn. And look, I do think you can go back a few years ago, even before things had fallen off. Some of those recruiting relationships were probably damaged a little bit with just some of the guys within the program and their roles in recruiting. You weren't doing a good enough job of staying on top of some of the best talent in state, and that definitely hurts you. Then once the program takes a nosedive, it really falls off a cliff. State's going to have to work to build that back up. That is a huge thing. And look, I think they got guys on staff who are good recruiters. I keep saying it. Offensively, I think they're going to be fine. It is a defensive recruiting issue for me at this point. But look, to close out talking recruiting, Cameron Thompson, good pickup for State. I think you probably rounded out your O-line class at this point with 5 commitments. I'm sure if there's a can't-miss prospect, you would still make room. You can't have enough big bodies in the room. But so far, you've done a good job recruiting the offensive line and offense as a whole. Moving on now, we're going to talk about the 5 most important games of the season for Mississippi State in 2025. These are the games that I think ultimately will shape the way the season goes for the Bulldogs. Now, and I'm not necessarily ranking these in order of, what game is a must win, what game is the most likely win. These are just games that I look at and I think with the way where that game falls in the schedule, the opportunity that presents itself, these I would say are the 5 most important games of the season. I alluded to one at the very beginning of the show. We're starting off, and it's the season opener at Southern Miss, as my number 5 most important game of the season. I think anytime you're coming off a season like the one Mississippi State just had, it kind of automatically puts you in a position where that season opener is going to be massive. You have to show to fans that things have turned around and that you are putting a good foot forward and that this 2025 season could be one to be excited about. It gets even more important when you consider you're playing an in-state opponent on the road, a team that is going to do everything in their possible power to pull an upset here. I'm not even saying this throwing shade at Southern Miss, but if you want to throw out Super Bowl game, yeah, this is going to be a Super Bowl for them. And I'm sure there's somebody rolling their eyes. How can 2-10 Mississippi State be a Super Bowl? This is an opportunity for that program. It's year one for Charles Huff. They're getting an in-state team that they want to beat worse than basically anyone else in their stadium to open up the season and begin a new era. There are some times that if you're a G5 program and you're playing these power conference teams, you look at those games and understand, our chances are probably pretty slim. Coaches will not admit this, but they 100% do it. There are some coaches that kind of look at those power conference games at the G5 level and say, let's just sort of get out of that healthy. We want to focus on what we do in conference. UAB used to do this a lot under Bill Clark. Bill Clark, fantastic coach at UAB, someone who I think, I know he stepped away for health issues. I think there's a lot of people who will tell you behind the scenes that's a guy that would have continued coaching if not for some of the issues at UAB. I think if he ever got a power conference job, he'd be outstanding. Go look at how UAB, for as good as they were under Clark, performed against power conference teams. They kind of didn't take those games seriously. They were just sort of trying to get in and out of it and then do what they did in conference play to really build up that team. I say that to say that's not going to be the case here for Southern Miss. They are 100% going into this game, going to throw out all the stops and try to do everything they can to win that ball game, because this is a statement opportunity for Charles Huff. And with that game being as big as it is for them, it becomes bigger for Mississippi State, because you can't just stroll down to Hattiesburg sleepwalking and assume you're going to get in and out with a win without putting forth any sort of effort. The last time State went to Hattiesburg, 2015, with Dak Prescott, they kind of slept walk through the first half of that game. And that was a much better Southern Miss team, but that was also a much better Mississippi State team. And I think they were trailing at halftime. Now, they ended up pulling away in the second half. It was never really in doubt when it was all said and done. But we're talking about, look, it's a bad Southern team, but it's also a Southern team that half the roster are the kids who won the Sun Belt a year ago at Marshall, and what was a legitimately good Marshall team. So that's not just a pushover opponent at this point, especially for where Mississippi State is at. And look, I do think State's much improved. I think State on paper should be able to win that game and win it easily. We all know sometimes those games don't play out on paper. You have to consider obviously the environment that you're in, the situation that you're in. That game gets bigger. And if you're Jeff Lebby, you've got to win it. And really, you got to win it comfortably. In terms of setting the tone for the season, if you just get out of there, survive, does that mean that the season's toast? No. Your fan base is not going to be bought in. If you go down to Hattiesburg and you win a game and come out of there with a one-score possession win or even a 10-point win, people aren't going to be happy. We talk about, and I see, Austin bringing up the home game with Arizona State. We will definitely be talking about that a little bit later here in the show. If you want that to be a packed-out crowd, you have to go down at Hattiesburg and win that game easily. I'm not going to sit here and say State needs to go and it'd be a 50-0 victory. It doesn't have to be a total beatdown. It needs to be a game where it is never in doubt, and there's never a moment where you look up and think Southern Miss has a chance in that game. If State's able to do that, that sets the tone for the season in a really positive way. If they go down to Hattiesburg and they kind of fool around and it just isn't – or even if they're not fooling around, even if they're giving full-out effort and it's just not a inspiring performance, again, for the team itself – maybe they can build off that and get going forward. But in terms of injecting life into your fan base, it has to be a much more complete game. It has to be a good showing for State to start off. So that season opener in Hattiesburg comes in. That is, to me, easily one of the 5 most important games of the season. Coming in at number 4, I've got the road trip to Arkansas to start off November. Arkansas probably is the most beatable SEC opponent State has on the schedule, which – feels kind of crazy to talk about when you consider what the Hogs did to Mississippi State last year in Starkville. But State did waste some opportunities to put some points on the board early in that game a year ago. And look, I don't think Arkansas is just going to be a complete terrible team this year. I think they've got some interesting pieces. Even with all the overturn on offense, I think they've got some interesting pieces. Defensively, it's a lot of overturn, but they like their linebackers. They think they're going to be better in the secondary. We'll see. It is in Fayetteville, though, which is difficult, even though State's won the last few times they've been there. Well, I guess they didn't win they won the last time they were there. They didn't win in 2021, but they had won previously before that. But Arkansas, look, it's a very difficult schedule. They're expected to be the worst of the teams State's going to play in the SEC. That in of itself means it's one of the more important games you're going to have this season because it's one of the better opportunities you're going to have at getting a win. And that's another big thing for Jeff Lebby this year. you need to find an SEC win. You can't have back-to-back seasons going 0-8 in the SEC, even if you won all 4 non-conference games and you got an upset over Arizona State, which would be massive. I mean, you're talking about going 4-0 in the non-con, which are your first 4 games, and then losing 8 straight to close the year. Nobody's going to be happy with that either. And again, that would be if you beat Arizona State, which is a big if. You need to be able to find some wins over the course of the season, and Arkansas is one of those games where it's more likely to be able to happen. Now, again, I'm not just going to come out here and predict that that's certainly going to be the case because it's on the road. It's a team that shellacked you at home a year ago. Again, State's a very different team. Arkansas is going to be a different team too, though. How is that game going to play out? I don't know. But what I do know is that that's an important opportunity for State. And that's one of the more beatable teams you're going to have on the schedule. If you're talking about being able to pick up a conference win, that's probably your best chance just in terms of the quality of the opponent. So, that's a team that Arkansas has a lot of questions. And is Sam Pittman even still going to be the head coach at that point? I don't know. But that is certainly one of the more winnable games you have on the schedule. It becomes one of the more important games you play. And if we get to November and State has not won an SEC game, that's going to put even more pressure on that game. Austin is, right ahead of me, which, I mean, I did write this from Maroon and White Nation, so that is out there because he's talking about the Tennessee game. Tennessee comes in as my number 3 most important game for the season. Look, Arkansas might be the most beatable of the SEC opponents on the schedule. I'm kind of down on Tennessee coming into the year, and we're not going to turn this into a Tennessee preview. I still think they're going to be fine. They'll be a good team, but I don't see them repeating what they did a year ago. They have a lot of questions, and that's a game in week 5 of the season. If State gets off to a good start to the year, even if you lose to Arizona State, if you were competitive in that game, give yourself a good show, and you go into that game 3-1, I think you're going to have a packed house in Starkville. Don't know that it'll be a night game. I know that's one of the flex kickoff times. It could be afternoon, it could be night. You would hope it's a night game. Tennessee still, like I said, they've got a lot of questions. Joey Aguilar at quarterback is not a sure thing. They're breaking in a mostly new offensive line. They're breaking in a bunch of new receivers. The run game, they don't have Dylan Sampson this year. Now, yes, Heupel's teams run the ball well pretty much every year, but last year was a little different with how well they were able to run the football. So losing Sampson is a big deal, especially when you consider all they're losing on the offensive line. That's an opportunity. Now, I think defensively Tennessee is still going to be really good, but they're probably not as dominant as they were a year ago, losing some of the pieces they did. But overall, they've got a lot of guys who played. They should be a good defense once again. But again, that's a team with questions coming to Starkville early in the season. And if you want to talk about Jeff Lebby getting a win, that not just sets the tone for the season, but sets the tone for the program, that's an opportunity. That is a game right there against Tennessee that you look at and say, if you can get a win here, one, you get really confident that the season ahead is going to be a fun one. I know the schedule gets more difficult going forward, but then you look at it and say, okay, at that point, they're at least 4 wins. They should be able to find a couple more and get to a bowl. Maybe you're 5-0. If you beat Tennessee, I mean, it's not out of the question that you beat Arizona State. If you're talking about a 5-0 Mississippi State, now we're talking about, can this be something like a really breakthrough type season? I'm not predicting State's going to be 5-0. All right. I'm not necessarily even predicting State's going to beat Arizona State. I'm not predicting they're necessarily going to beat Tennessee. I still really don't know where I'm at on my predictions for this team. I kind of have an idea in my head of where I'm at record-wise, but picking the games, that's another question. But purely just from a situation standpoint and where you could set yourself up, if you are able to get a win over Tennessee, that springboards the program. That springboards the rest of the season. That sets you up for a really good 2025 relative to expectation. I'm not saying if State beats Tennessee, all of a sudden they're going up winning 8-9 games. No, it's not where I'm at. But you feel like they're going to go to a bowl game. And that would be huge for this team with where they're at. Now, are they going to actually break through and do that? That's to be seen. But that's why this is one of the more important games of the schedule. This is a true opportunity. Austin coming in, Mississippi State at night is something special to watch. The Cowbells and just watching it on TV. Love night games in Mississippi State. So do I. And look, I hope this is a night game. We don't know for sure that it will be. But they do get a night game for Arizona State, which that'll be an outstanding environment. Tennessee's a big opportunity. I think, obviously, if things go poorly the first few weeks of the season, that changes the environment and how just the feeling around the program going in. But if you do what you're supposed to do, You set up a situation where State should be no worse than 3-1 going into that game. It should be an outstanding atmosphere. It should be a huge opportunity for Jeff Lebby to get this program moving forward. Number 2 on the list, I got the Egg Bowl. I think it'd be tough most seasons to not have the Egg Bowl as one of the 5 most important games of the season for Mississippi State. Just the rivalry, it's always going to be one of the most important games you play. Even if roles were reversed and what's going on for Ole Miss was going on for State right now, I think you would still have to say, hey, winning that game and continuing to have success is an important thing for keeping hierarchy within the SEC, hierarchy within the state of Mississippi. That game's always going to be important. State's lost 4 out of 5. That is the worst stretch that they've had in the Egg Bowl since the early 2000s. Austin, if Mississippi State beats Tennessee, I think the fans will be rejuvenated and love it. Yeah, 100%. No, that would be a huge, huge breakthrough for the program. But State's lost 4 out of 5 in the Egg Bowl. That's their worst stretch since the early 2000s. If you lose another and talk about 5 out of 6, they haven't done that since the 80s, which is the last time that we really talked about State and Ole Miss as there being a clear dividing line between the programs. Up until right now, there's no arguing it right now. Ole Miss is in a much better place. The 80s is the last time where you had year after year of evidence showing that the program is just in programs were in different spots. Obviously, we've had a couple of years here or there where things have fluctuated between the two teams. That's the last time it got that bad. Lebby needs to find a way to win that game. And Ole Miss, with the questions they're going to have this year, I still think they'll be fine, but they've got questions up front of the offensive line. Are they going to be as dominant as receiver without a threat like you had in Trey Harris? I know the slot guy they have coming back, I'm blanking on his name. I know they like him a lot. I know they like the transfers they have. It's not as strong a receiving core as you had last year. Defensively, that defensive front is not going to be what it was. They're losing a ton of experience in the secondary. I know like the transfers they brought in, Jalen Braxton being one of the top of the list. But it's not going to be the same team that it was a year ago. And could this be a situation like you had a couple seasons ago in 2022 where, an Ole Miss team that went portal heavy starts off the year really well, but then things start to fade late in the season and then State's able to get it done in the Egg Bowl? I don't know. You certainly hope so. But, that's not a team that's going – I don't think they're going to be as good as they were a year ago. And obviously State last year goes into Oxford and 26-14 is your final. And as we know, State wasted several opportunities in that game to put more points on the board. Just with some dumb mistakes, simply. I mean, look, it's in Starkville. State's going to have a chance in the game. But that is a huge game for Lebby. And I'm not saying you can't achieve your goals for the season if you don't win the Egg Bowl. You absolutely can. That game should not define the season, but it is a big deal. And knowing the state of the rivalry currently with where Ole Miss is at as a program and the fact that, again, they've already won 4 of the last 5. As I said, you're basically looking at 20 years since they've been that dominant in this series. You have to find a way to flip that. You have to find a way to make this competitive from a result standpoint once again. So that game's going to be huge. Austin, do you think at Missouri is an important game? Because I think it's very winnable. Missouri has lost some odd games before. I should be pulling these comments up on screen. I just haven't. Missouri's definitely an important game. Mizzou's an interesting team. I don't really know what I think of them at this point. I know they got a lot of new pieces. I know Kevin Coleman's going to be really good, and because I know he's a really good player, having seen him last year and knowing what they were able to do with Luther Burden, they'll utilize Coleman fine. Prabula at quarterback. There's some questions there, but I know they've got some guys back on the offensive line and in the defense that are some good pieces to build around. They're going to have a good running back. I think it's Ahmad Hardy, the transfer from ULM, who's going to be really good at what they want to do in the run game. So, yeah, I don't know what to think of Mizzou. I definitely think they're probably taking a step back, which means on paper that's one of the games you could look at and say you've got a chance. But right now I would have them I wouldn't have them in the top 5 right now just because I think they're probably not as beatable or as impactful a game as some of these others we have on the schedule. Number 1, we've kind of alluded to it a few times. That Arizona State game to me is easily the most important game of the season because of what that game can do to you the rest of the way. A win in that game really does show that things have turned around. And I understand Arizona State. There's people who, even after going to the playoff a year ago, are still going to look at that team and say, it's still Arizona State. You don't think much about them. Roster talent isn't anything incredible, which I'll say their roster talent's pretty dang good this year. The Shrine Bowl put out the for each team, like how many guys they have that are on watch list, and like half that roster are guys that are looked at as potential NFL prospects right now. That's a really freaking good team. It's not a case of they lost Cam Scadaboo and they're going to be taking a big step back. No, they're probably going to be really freaking good. They're going to be able to run the ball too. Kanye Udo coming over from Army, he may not be Scadaboo, but that guy can play. And they're going to be able to run the football really effectively once again. That's a really good team. That is a huge measuring stick game early in the season. You get that game in Starkville. And look, I talked about with game number 5 on the list, Southern Miss. If you do what you're supposed to do against Southern Miss, I think you're going to have a packed house in Starkville for a night game. Should be an incredible atmosphere. Breaking in the new LED lights at the stadium, which a lot of people are going to be really excited for the chance to see. That game is huge. That is a chance for Jeff Lebby to make a statement. This thing has turned around. We have taken a step forward. Even if you don't win, and I know people don't want to play the moral victory game, a competitive loss to Arizona State would still be a sign that this team is moving forward. And I know people will say they were competitive on the road to Arizona State last year, and they were to an extent. But we can't forget they were down like 30-3 in that game. Now, obviously, State wasted a few opportunities that they could have put some more points on the board early. But I think that was also a case of Arizona State kind of got up big, coasted a little bit, and State was able to fight back into it. I think it'd be a little bit different this time. If you're blow for blow with Arizona State throughout the game, that would be a more competitive battle than what you saw a year ago in Tempe. But that is a statement game. That is an opportunity to show, okay, this thing's turned around. And if you win that game, then you feel great. We're starting 4-0 because you feel good about beating Northern Illinois. You feel good about being able, obviously, to beat Alcorn. You're not worried about that game from Will. Hopefully it won't take 2.5 quarters to swap to a 4-front, slow down the running game like last year. I go back and forth on that. I didn't think that was a great game plan. Certainly, I'm not going to defend that against Scadaboo. As for how they did it for the whole season, I think is another discussion. I will be interested to see what they do, though, in that game for this year, because Arizona State's going to be a different team. Sam Levitt obviously has a lot more hype around him as an NFL prospect, and they got some pass catchers they like as well. That's going to be a really interesting team, and how State plays them defensively. That's your first real big test. We know that it's a good defense with Jordan Tyson at receiver. I mentioned Udo coming in and running back is a really good player. I think they have a tight end that they like quite a bit, and then Levitt at quarterback. That is a huge test for the Bulldog defense, so we can really gauge, okay, how much improved are they, if at all, compared to last year. But again, that is the game that sets the tone for the season more than almost anything else. If you beat Arizona State, would Mississippi State be a bowl team this year? Could they find 2 wins in SEC play? I would think their odds would certainly be significantly higher, which I know that's a dumb thing to say. Of course, if you won all your non-conference games, your odds are going to be higher. But also from a momentum standpoint, your odds would be a lot higher, because at that point, you feel really good you're starting 4-0. And I know I hit on this earlier in the show. It's hard to think they would start 4-0 and then not find at least one more win the rest of the way, but you would have to think they could probably find a couple. If you're able to get off to a 4-0 start to the season, which you got to beat Arizona State to pull that off, you feel really good about this team being able to pick up wins, pick up momentum. And that's a big reason why this is my most important game. A win here gets you rolling. A win here, again, it sets you up to handle business in the non-con, sets the stage for that Tennessee game that we've already mentioned is really important for the season. Getting the win over Arizona State sets you up for a breakthrough year under Lebby, where you at least feel like, yeah, we can get to a bowl game, which would be a breakthrough for this team and this program at this point. Competitive game where you lose, you can still build off that. Bowl chances are probably a lot more slim, but you can clearly show, okay, this team's program's taking a step forward, and you feel good about going forward. But this game, I think, really does set the tone for the season. You take a sip of water. Now, moving in to what I wanted to kind of close out the show with. and talking about that Arizona State game, because I think Arizona State's an interesting team to look at if you're Mississippi State in terms of the transition they had to go through over the last couple of years and what it turned into last year for them, and kind of the parallels when you look at Mississippi State. Arizona State, year one under Kenny Dillingham, is back in 2023. They scored under 18 points a game on offense, gave up about 32 points a game defensively. They went 3-9. One of those wins was a close win over FCS Southern Utah. They got shut out 29-0 at home to Fresno State. Now, I will say, conference play, they were pretty competitive. Kind of spiraled on them late in the year, but they were fairly competitive in conference play, and they did get a couple conference wins. They beat a Washington State team that was 5-7, wasn't great, but also wasn't terrible. They beat a UCLA team that was 8 wins, and that UCLA win was very interesting. That was a game where Arizona State basically played the swinging gate formation because they had 1 million injured offensive linemen and receivers, and they just had to kind of just go with a random approach for one game, and it worked because UCLA just wasn't ready for it. But they played tough, and they at least showed, okay, this thing's in a really rough spot, but they can kind of build out of it. Austin, if Mississippi State gets in a shootout with Arizona State and Starkville, do you think they could go blow for blow with them? I think State could be equipped to go win a shootout. I think State could be equipped to win a shootout with a lot of teams this year. I like what they've got offensively. But going back talking about Arizona State, that was a rough year one for them. And they had to completely flip the roster after that. They brought in 30 transfers, a ton of new pieces on the offensive line, a ton of new pieces to the defensive line. Talked about getting bigger on the defensive line as one of the big points of emphasis for them to not just get pushed around. They brought in a lot of skill pieces that they were going to have to rely upon. Brought in a quarterback. They were kind of a brand new team going into last year. And expectations were not high for them. I think everyone recognized, it's going to be tough for them to be worse, but they were picked last in the Big 12 for a reason. It looked like this is clearly the bottom team within the Big 12. And they open up the year. Just talking about the team a little bit in terms of early season, or preseason, I remember people looking at their non-conference slate of Wyoming, Mississippi State, and Texas State and saying they might go 0-3 in that. Wyoming had been a really good G5 program for several years. Mississippi State, people did not have high expectations for last year, but nobody knew that the bottom was going to fall out the way that it did. And Texas State had really high expectations, and they were hitting Arizona State in that game. Well, they blow out Wyoming to open the season, which showed very clearly, okay, this team's better. This team has taken a legitimate step forward. Then they get that win over Mississippi State that, as I mentioned, they had to hold on to, but they were dominating that game for much of it. Now, how much of that is Mississippi State's own wrongdoing with how they were playing defense, with some of the mistakes they made on offense? Well, you can debate that. But they were up 30-3. They were coasting, and they hold on, though, and they get the win. And I remember that Mississippi State game was being talked about. Arizona State fans going into the season, because I was listening to Arizona State pods, trying to get an idea of the Sun Devils going into last year. That game was circled as this is the opportunity to show we've moved forward. This program is moving in a new direction. This program is ready to compete and at least be a bowl team and move forward. They get that win in front of their home fans. They had a great student section that night, and it really gave them momentum. Then they go and they beat Texas State on the road. And that was a game that was, Texas State was ahead and ended up kind of trailing. Late, it was a back and forth affair, but they found a way to get a win. Now, look, they did lose the next week at Texas Tech, but they started off a year 3-0 when a lot of people were talking about they could be 0-3. And that set momentum for them for the rest of the year. And I think Mississippi State, you kind of look at that and say, can State do something similar? Now, I am not at all talking about State jumping towards being a playoff team. That's not what this is. Arizona State playing in the Big 12 certainly helped that. Arizona State also had a lot of close game luck. I think they went 6-2 in one-score games when it was all said and done. They typically did a pretty good job in those competitive close games, and that's why they were able to have the season that they did. But they flipped the roster in one offseason. I talk about flipping the trenches. That was a big thing that they had to do. They got much stronger up front after being terrible on the offensive line the year before. Some of that was injuries. It was not just a talent thing. They were really banged up in 2023, stayed healthy in 2024. Their defensive line became pretty good when it was all said and done. And you look at all the other pieces on their team really settled in. And as I mentioned, going into this season, they have a roster full of guys that NFL scouts are interested in. If you're Mississippi State, I think you look at that and say, like, man, one, being able to pull off a one-year roster overhaul, is it tougher in the SEC? Absolutely. But we've talked about State reloading the trenches. They went heavy in the portal for both offensive and defensive line. They feel like that O-line is in a much better spot. They feel like defensive line, they have significantly more depth. They have more size. Again, that was something I talked about with Arizona State. So you're not just getting pushed around up front. The safety room, we think State's in a good spot. We think they're in a good spot in the linebacker room. Offensively, I've kind of already mentioned it. I like the skill talent they have. I like Blake Shapen at quarterback. The pieces are there to be a really good offense. The pieces are there on defense to not be horrific. And if you want to talk about Arizona State, what they did last year, offensively 33 points a game, defensively about 23, which they were even better defensively than I think a lot of people would have expected. And again, opponents matter. Level of competition matters. I don't think State's defense is going to be that good going into this year, but this should be improved. So if you can have that type of flip, and if you can look at what Arizona State was able to pull off, like that's reason to feel confident, one, this can happen. But it's very interesting how Mississippi State is in the exact same spot Arizona State was a year ago, with that Arizona State game being kind of the potential launching pad for the rest of the season. That game against Mississippi State last year set Arizona State up to have the season they did. And people will come back, it's a talking point that's come up recently because Arizona State was sort of cited as the reason the Big 12 is doing away with preseason media polls, because they felt the fact that Arizona State was picked 16th and ended up winning the conference was a bad look for the strength of the league, and that hurt them in the playoff standings. And what people have fired back with is Arizona State was looked down upon because they barely beat Mississippi State. They barely beat Texas State. They lost to Cincinnati. Yeah, those things happened. And you're right, that Mississippi State win, is it impressive to beat Mississippi State by one touchdown at home last year? No, it is not, when you consider the season Mississippi State had. It didn't matter, though, because you built upon it. And it gave them momentum. It gave them confidence. Nobody knew at that time Mississippi State was that going to be a garbage football team in 2024. People did not know that. Winning that game gave a lot of momentum. Now, the difference here is State is not getting an Arizona State team that's going to be terrible. That's one of the big holdups on the point that I'm making. Arizona State got a team that on paper, there was some notoriety, and it ended up being a really bad team. Arizona State may not be the Big 12 champ. The Big 12 is so volatile that if you told me Arizona State with all the pieces they brought back ended up going like 7-5, 8-4, it's not out of the question just because that's the nature of playing in the Big 12. But at the same time, they're still going to be a really good football team. So for State, you're not getting a pushover on the schedule. In the way that Arizona State, we found out, they had a pushover team and they were able to get the win. That certainly makes things more difficult. But the opportunity is the same. The opportunity at a program-changing, trajectory-changing win in week 2 of the season still exists. And again, you can look. It's very interesting to me the parallels that are there between what Arizona State was a year ago in the position that they were in and where Mississippi State is at this year. That is a huge game for the season, and if you're State, you certainly have to hope that you can improve enough that you take a step forward and that you can look at what Arizona State did and kind of set things up the same way. Will, from dead last total defense like 13th, is a real chance to go 6-6. Yeah. And look, I mean, I'll be honest, they could possibly be last in defense again and still improve if the defense is in last, but not by like 12 points like they were last year. That's the other thing. They were 16th in defense and it wasn't even close. If you're 16th in defense, but the quality of your defense is pretty comparable to the other teams towards the bottom of the SEC, you might be okay. But in terms of just in general improvement, you're absolutely right. Mississippi State, if things fall the way I could see 7-8 wins, not too bad of a schedule. That's going to be tough. I mean, I do think it is kind of too bad of a schedule. I think the schedule is really, 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 really difficult. I mean, you got 4 teams coming to Starkville that are playoff teams a year ago, plus an Ole Miss team that was right on the outside looking in. You don't have any gimmies on the road. It's a tough slate. Bryce Hall, O-line worries me more than most people think. Bringing in so many guys from Spain makes me think the run-pass production will struggle for the first 4 games so like last year. It's a fair concern. It's definitely a fair concern. I think it would be hard for them to be worse than they were a year ago. And the fact they got to a point where they could run the ball decently, not consistently, but decently, makes me think this unit will be able to at least do that. And if they can do that more effectively, that helps out Shapen a little bit. Now, to the point of struggling early as you're having to piece things together, yeah, that's a totally fair point. That's absolutely something early in the season that could be problematic. Jeff Lebby seems to think that unit is improved. We have a video about that on our channel, come media days. They feel like the offensive line is taking a legitimate step forward with the pieces they were able to bring in the spring. If that unit is just serviceable, then you're talking about, I think, a really good Mississippi State offense and one that can do a lot of damage. If the jump from 16 to 15 was the same as like 12 to 1. Yeah, it was insane, the difference between where State was at. And I think it was LSU who was in 15th. May not have been LSU. I don't remember who it was. But yeah, look, this is a State team I think has a chance to be improved, but Arizona State is a team you look at last year and you look at that and say, that's your goal if you're Mississippi State. Orchestrate that type of turnaround from a team quality standpoint. Again, the result standpoint's a little different because the Big 12 allowed them to be a playoff team. That's not realistic for Mississippi State in no way, shape, or form. But can you be a bowl team? If you have that type of turnaround, sure. And if you were able to get that win early in the season, that sets you up for the rest of the way. So that's going to be a big game. That'll do it for me today. Not sure when we'll be back. Definitely we'll have a show next week on Monday. Christian will be back on that pod. But yeah, really looking forward to doing this. It was great having some people in the live chat. We didn't have anybody last time, so I think we got up to like 9 viewers, which, hey, I'm definitely pleased with that. And great to have the comments bumping. Appreciate y'all for checking in and providing some commentary throughout. It was a lot of fun. But that'll do it for me today. Thanks to everybody for tuning in, and I'll see y'all next time.